Thank you for coming back. We are at the end almost. There's going to be a kind of closing words next after this at I think 4:15 or so. So after this we'll head down there. But I just wanted to sort of close out with some observations really on kind of the maturity of this industry and the maturity of companies that are operating within it. We have this online assessment, which is 15 questions or so. You answer them, it'll plot you on a maturity scale for conversational automation, and it'll offer you some advice, basically, in things that you might want to do to consider getting to the next phase of maturity. We've had probably about 100 or so of those filled in by companies over the last 8 to 12 months or so. And so I just wanted to share some of that data, basically, to try and give us a bit of an understanding about where are most organizations in their kind of maturity. But before we kind of get to that, I want to just show a little bit about how the kind of like technology itself is maturing over time. This is the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Enterprise Conversational AI Platforms, which was released either last week or the week before. And what is everyone familiar with this, the MQ? Did you see the most recent one? So this is looking at last year versus this year. Anything that's black is last year's positioning. Anything that's a color or gray is this year. And what it essentially shows is that if I move on one slide, you can see here there's a bit of a gap emerging here. A lot of companies that are in the green have gone up on both metrics, their ability to execute and completeness of vision, and these ones have all kind of come down. So there's a lot of people have issues with Gartner's assessment and their kind of qualification criteria and all that kind of stuff. I have issues with it as well, and I also have issues with the kind of whole pay-to-play mentality of it and their kind of criteria around revenue and number of customers and that kind of stuff. I have issues with how they classify voice capabilities in particular because, it's not strictly an entirely fair process. However, some of the metrics are fairly decent, and it gives you a snapshot around how things are changing compared to last year, because what they use to measure hasn't changed much since last year, or if at all. And so it just shows, compared to what they're measuring, things have matured. So the technology has matured in one area, and some of these kind of other companies have potentially not necessarily keeping up. So I think what we're going to see, as I said at the beginning of this year, is that the technology companies that are doing really well, they're going to have a lot of momentum, they're going to continue to do very well, and that gap is going to grow, I think we'll see over the next number of years. What's also changed is how people's priorities in terms of what they're focusing on or what they're interested in. So at the beginning of 2020, I did this poll on LinkedIn. VUX World, historically, probably in 2017 to 2020, was very focused on voice assistants and ambient computing and, Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant, that kind of stuff. And so I asked this poll on LinkedIn and said, what kind of emerging voice channel provides the most opportunities for businesses? And most people in 2020 were saying Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa. That was right around the time when I was realizing that my background in digital transformation was crying out for conversational AI technology, and it was right around the time when I was planning on changing VUX World from focusing on voice assistants to really getting into enterprise transformation. And so I wanted to do a bit of a pulse check to see where people were in terms of their kind of priorities. Fast forward to the beginning of this year, I did the exact same poll, and most people think that the opportunities are in the contact center. So the only reason I'm mentioning this kind of before and after is that in 2020, as I said before, the progression of this stuff starts out in novelty-based use cases, moves towards productivity-based use cases, and then results in monetized use cases. In 2020, I think, broadly speaking, from a conversational UI point of view, we were stuck in that novelty phase. And I think what this is showing in that people's increase in appetite to explore call center and contact center automation on the voice channel is a maturity in terms of now we're focusing on productivity-based use cases, which I think is a good sign. This is the maturity assessment here. Behind this, there's a whole bunch of different kind of like criteria that makes up these, but basically you've got incubation, which is we haven't done anything yet, we're thinking about it, we know there's an opportunity, it's on our radar, but we haven't done anything yet. Crawling is exploring, which is essentially putting together your initial strategy, your first priority use cases, proof of concepts, things like that. Taking it serious is walking, which is where you've got something live, you're beginning to get together your kind of operational side of things. You might have like a one-way integration into line of business systems. Running is where you're developing that kind of center of excellence. It starts to take it a bit more seriously. You might have two-way kind of integrations into your business systems. You're becoming a lot more data-driven. You're thinking about kind of multiple channel and omni-channel. You're starting to get a real handle on your KPIs and how you're measuring success. And crucially, the business is starting to take notice and really kind of prioritize it as well. You've got relay, which is when you get towards the democratization side of things, which is more like a federated center of excellence, where you've got more siloed teams working on their own kind of things, and that becomes really about standardizing things, standardizing your technology, standardizing your design, standardizing your processes. It becomes around how do you govern that, how do you make sure that what goes out the door is quality and consistent. And then total fitness is I liken this a little bit to, if you look at the maturity of kind of technology in general from a sort of digital transformation perspective, when you get to the point where your staff and your workers think first about digital rather than analog, so for example, if you need to develop a new process for HR or whatever it might be, the first port of call in most people's minds is how do we do this online, or how do we automate this kind of process? You start to develop this kind of like total fitness, which is where it becomes business as usual. And so we've got a number of questions in this assessment that cover these kind of these four categories basically, which is the strategy. So how is their business approaching the strategy definition? How is the organization organizing itself to be able to deliver? What is the impact on the customer experience, and how are you providing technologies to be able to underpin this activity? And so the questions in this maturity assessment, there's only about 15 of them, but they get at some of these areas. We've had about, as I said, we've had about 100 or so responses over the last number of months, and I want to show a little bit of analysis of that, essentially. The first thing is around ROI and how do we measure ROI. And where most people begin when it comes to ROIs, they start to think about how do we save costs? How do we reduce phone calls? How do we measure the impact of this stuff? They don't tend to think as much necessarily about strategic ROI or capability-based ROI, which is how closely tied to our core business strategy is this stuff, and how are we going to measure our progress towards our transformation vision and incorporate this into our broader, wider business strategy. And the other thing is capability-based. And when I talk about capability-based ROI, for example, there's a lot of companies that will outsource their conversational AI capabilities because in the short term, they think that if it's a bit of a headache, they don't have the skills, they don't have the technology, they don't know what to do. So they might outsource something completely. What that means is that you lose control over your customer experience. In some cases, you might lose control over your data, and you don't develop your internal capabilities. So that when that HR use case rears its head, as I mentioned, and you want to quickly create something that allows people to book holidays, or you have a new user need that you've discovered and you want to try and cater for that in a conversation, you're then hampered by having to go to a third party, having to go to external, and your costs are kind of going up, and there's a whole bunch of risk associated to that. So it's about trying to think about how are you developing your internal capabilities and how you measure an ROI against that stuff. So when I asked in this assessment, how are people thinking about ROI, 40% of people that submitted this said that they're using measurable ROI, which is fine, it's where most people start, and 19% said they're still figuring it out. So it would suggest to me that at least this is a small sample set, it's a small data set, so it's not empirical, and I'm not saying that this is kind of quotable and necessarily accurately a reflection of what's actually going out in there. This is just the people who happen to have submitted this assessment, and the data is it's too small to take for granted, essentially. There's only 100 or so respondents. But having said that, if you were to just take this data, it would show that in terms of maturity from those that have submitted it, there is only kind of like 40% or so who are looking at other ways of measuring ROI. The other side of things is how do you approach this? So I mentioned there, do you outsource it? Do you insource it? Do you partner? Do you build all the stuff yourself? Do you kind of assemble all of your capabilities using components? Do you acquire a company like Walmart have been doing recently? Do you bring in a platform that you can build on top of? There's lots of different options, and we've got a guide that basically looks at the pros and cons and benefits of each kind of method. If you could take a photo on that before we crack on. But in terms of how people are approaching it, based on this assessment again, 34% have outsourced it in terms of the design and build, and they do some maintenance themselves. 7% have outsourced it entirely, and 30% of doing it in-house with a small team, but it's in addition to their current jobs. So what that kind of shows to me is that if you look at the more mature teams, they've got a dedicated team, they've got dedicated resources, they might have multiple teams spread across different types of activities. And so broadly speaking, we're seeing that, at least from those that have submitted this assessment, most are either outsourcing it because it's not something they can do, or they're kind of doing it as part of their day job. So one of the things to do to try and develop your maturity is to get into a situation where you're developing things yourself, because that means that you're building your internal capabilities. Another thing is, from a kind of operations side of things, it's very easy to fall into the kind of waterfall trap in this, which this kind of depicts, which is you spend an awful lot of time doing design, spend an awful lot of time building, an awful lot of time testing, then you launch something, and only at that point do you find out whether it actually does the job that you think it's going to do. The value or the benefits of conversational AI is actually you can create something very quickly, and you can test it very quickly with a small proportion of your user base to gather data. We spoke with Mark earlier on, who'd gone out and done qualitative user research to test his applications to see how it's actually performing with real people. And what that means is that you start to develop this process of you design something and then you test and validate it. And the quicker you can test your design by getting it in front of people, the sooner you can validate whether or not you're going to have a successful end product. And then you build and test it again. And again, what happens often is that when it comes to the kind of, once you've built something, very rarely do we go back to design. We tend to just kind of optimize the technical development sort of process rather than thinking about, okay, we have a potential new requirement here. It's not necessarily as simple as putting a new intent into our model and firing it away. Maybe we need to go back and think about how does that intent change the dynamics of the conversation and do a bit more testing. And then when you launch it, again, you can go through the same kind of process. You're analyzing what's coming through, you're planning on what you're going to do about it, you design, test again, build, test again, and launch, and you kind of go through this sort of cycle. So the more mature teams have more of a kind of agile approach to doing this, which is built on getting feedback and making decisions based on data. So when we ask about people's approach to this, most people, 27% said actually, when it comes to developing conversational AI systems, we don't actually have a process. We just kind of make it up as we go along. 22% say that we have a new process for every project. What that means is really it's not that much different to just making it up as you go along, because you're not having a defined process. 18% have kind of like a process in their heads, which is fine, but what that means is that you don't have consistency between different departments doing the same sort of stuff. And a few kind of like the 30% have an actual defined process. So we say that there's a little bit of a lack of maturity from a sort of like operational process perspective with this stuff based on those who've completed this. This is another model we created that shows the kind of like maturity of use cases that you may see, and often companies start here, which is the deflective kind of use cases, question and answering, that kind of stuff. Interpreting is more around kind of understanding people's needs, a little bit more sophisticated. So for example, you might see sentiment analysis or routing here. I would say data retrieval, like one-way data retrieval from a system is a good example of that. Then it moves into transacting, which is where you can start to get more business value. You start to actually do things for customers. You start to kind of like help people actually get stuff done, which involves two-way system integrations. Assisting is about more kind of being a lot more proactive, using data that you may have from other conversations or context that you've got from the customer's current context, which might be previous web pages they've been on, previous web searches that they've done, previous activity in your CRM, and start to really kind of becoming more assistive where the customer doesn't necessarily know what they need. The assistant's job is to help guide them and help them figure it out. And then transforming is where you're creating better than human experiences. You're creating things and services that you couldn't hope to deliver with humans alone. So a good example of that is, for example, like let's take a retailer who may send a text message whenever a parcel has been marked as out for delivery, or another text message that says your parcel is going to be delayed by 2 days. If you had the ability to respond to that text message and say, okay, if that's the case, can you just leave it by the bins, or can you just leave it in the porch? You start to kind of inform the delivery driver or what have you about additional needs that you have. And then, for example, they might text back and say, I don't know, I noticed that you were also, to say, sorry, we're going to offer you 10% on your next order because it's delayed. And if you are interested in purchasing something now, then we can, I don't know, expedite the delivery process or something like that. So for example, let's say that the retailer text says your parcel is going to be delayed. To say sorry, we're going to save you 10% on your next order. You're ordering these trainers. A lot of people buy these socks that go with them. Do you want us to just add that onto your order and charge the card ending 4792? If the user said yes, How many of those would actually convert? Who knows? But what you're in a situation of there is you're turning some bad news, which is your parcel's going to be delivered, into a revenue generating opportunity, which you're able to do at scale thousands of times a day, which humans could never do. And so this is what we talk about when we talk about more transformative use cases, is you're combining lots of different types of technology, lots of different types of data to be able to deliver value for both customers and the business that, that you wouldn't be able to do without the technology. Of the assessment, most people who filled it in are covering deflecting-based use cases, over 60%, which again is where most people start. Few are in kind of like one-way system integrations, data retrieval, that kind of stuff, and kind of less on the rest. So slightly less kind of maturity there. This is a Wordly map, which allows you to essentially map the capabilities that you require for a system that you're going to build. And the way that I think about conversational AI is that there's components that you need, depending on how you approach it, there's components that you need that are either a commodity. For example, in John's example of his voice user interface, the commoditized element there is the microphone that's in the phone. The audio processing is fairly commoditized because you can send that audio to AWS and anyone can use that kind of same service. You need the telephony channel, which you might buy from a telephony provider. So that's already being built. It's not something that you need to create yourself. The automatic speech recognition, same sort of thing. You might just use Amazon or Microsoft or what have you. But then there's things that are required to be a custom build, which are things that you can't just buy off the shelf and things that are more specific to your business. Some companies have dialogue management in this area. You can find now more kind of commoditized, more kind of purchasable dialogue managers, but a lot of companies will still build their own. Response generation is going to be custom to you because each use case is going to be different depending on the business. Your data requirements might be different. The analytics might be custom because although there's analytics providers out there, what they don't tend to do is allow you to report on conversation metrics and business metrics in the same place. And so you might have to build something custom for that. And then this Genesis area is areas where it's a bit of a dark area. You really don't know much about it. So for example, if you've got a homegrown line of business booking system that you need to integrate with, there may be a bit of discovery needed to do that. And so taking this kind of viewpoint enables you to kind of map out like what are the core things we need to do to deliver this use case and how should we go about doing it? Should we just buy it off the shelf? Should we customize it for our own needs or do we have to do a lot more work? And when we asked in this assessment, like how do you approach this stuff? How do you approach kind of getting the right capabilities that you need? You've got 29% of people that say that they've got a chatbot platform, which I think that's where most start. And the genesis of a lot of these chatbot platforms is they started out as chatbot platforms and they don't support voice. And so a lot of people have simply chatbot platforms that don't support voice. 30% are working more on a capability kind of basis, which is that they'll assemble the capabilities that they need based on the use case. So they might take speech recognition from Amazon or Google, and they'll take an NLU from Rasa, and they'll take text-to-speech from Amazon, and they'll just kind of like knock together the capabilities that they need to do this. 18% have got no capabilities whatsoever, and 18% have multiple platforms, which is, it tends to happen, lots of businesses are in that situation where one department uses one chatbot platform, another uses another platform. And so essentially what you're able to do, if you've got this capability-based approach, it requires more resource, slightly less scalable. The kind of like conversational AI platform perspective allows people to democratize the creation, and it abstracts a lot of these capabilities to then be able to accelerate the creation a little bit more. So most of if you're either building your own platform or you use a third-party kind of platform that's open enough to be able to ingest the capabilities that you need from all of these different providers, you're in a bit of a better position. But there's less people who are doing that today. We've mentioned a lot of the challenges that we've spoke about all through the day, really, in terms of access to data or business systems. And actually, what's refreshing is that most people who've submitted this report have said that they've got API access to most business systems, which is really refreshing. I think that's a sign of a lot of people who've gone through some degree of digital transformation. They've probably exposed a lot of their services in their mobile app or their website. And so actually, a lot of organizations have the capabilities that they need to be able to build some of these transaction-based or more transformative services, which is a really good sign. So in kind of summary, what it seems as though the areas where the business has been maturing from a technology point of view or from a data point of view generally that enabled it to do well on mobile and well in online, those areas are fairly mature. The areas that are kind of slightly less mature is the bits that come specifically down to conversational AI in particular, which you know, it's not good or bad. It's just seemingly where we are, which is, if I was to look at that scale again, most organizations are probably at the bottom end of that scale. There's a few outliers and a few who are doing really, really well. But most organizations are kind of fairly early in their journey. They're mostly exploring deflective kind of based use cases. Maybe they're starting to look at voice, maybe they're starting to look at transactional use cases, which for me is mad, because going back to 2017, I thought that like the first time anyone's experienced a voice user interface, that would just accelerate everything. And every business is going to have their own assistant that they're going to plug into all these different channels, and it's going to be really simple and straightforward. I should have known better, because at the time I was working in government, and it's just surrounded by red tape and bureaucracy and process, which is a nightmare to overcome. Old legacy systems which are a nightmare to integrate with. And when you get to a certain level of scale, it becomes even more complex, because there's a lot more people, there's a lot more kind of things that you need to consider. But I just thought I'd share that with you, which is, you know, generally speaking, from those 100 or so people who filled in that assessment, where we are generally, and hopefully it was useful. If you want to do that assessment, you can just scan that QR code there, or go to vux.la/m, and you can do it for yourself and see where you kind of sit on that scale, and some of the things that you might want to consider to do next. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions. We've got a little bit of time before we go downstairs. Go on, John.
Yeah, that was great, mate. Thank you. Just a quick one. I was just curious about if you look forward into where there might be, we'll call it a tipping point, but you think where maturity is 3 years away, 2.5 years away. Just curious about your process.
Yeah, I think it's changing all the time. What I've noticed over the last 12 months, speaking to a lot more companies, is that there is a lot of companies that are trying to get to the more sort of transactional stuff. Some of them are doing it in part. We heard from Decathlon earlier on, who are kind of starting to get to the sort of like more transactional based sort of use cases, where I think most of the value is. Like the FAQ stuff's nice, but it's part of a broader journey. People are asking questions because they want to get something done at the end of the day. So I don't know, from a time perspective, it's always ongoing. I think there's obviously challenges in getting there, system challenges, company challenges, you know, organizational challenges. I would say if we continue where we are now, most organizations began doing this between 2018 and 2020, and those ones, though, likes of, you know, Decathlon and some of the banks and stuff, are a lot more progressive. It's more the mid-market, I think, that's mostly kind of less so. So I think that already, if we were to do like a spread of organization type, you'd probably see that the larger organizations are probably slightly more mature, the smaller organizations are slightly less mature. But I think within the space of 2 to 3 years, it'll change every year, I think, anyway, to be honest with you. But when will we get to a point where we can look at an assessment like that and say the industry is mature? I don't know. It's crystal ball stuff in it. Who knows? Yeah. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? No? Cool. I should check online, really, shouldn't I? Is there any questions online? Is there anyone still online? Is it 5 o'clock somewhere yet? Let's have a quick look online. In a moment, we're going to go downstairs. Well, you don't have to go. I'm not going to kind of drag you all down there, but I'll be going down there. And we're going to do some sort of like closing remarks, and we're going to be joined by, there's no questions online, no problem. Yeah, we're going to go downstairs in a minute. We're going to do some kind of like closing remarks, summarizing what we've learned, and then we'll probably all go to the pub and get drunk. So thank you all for coming, and I'll see you downstairs in 5 minutes.